Tonight, it's the one-year anniversary of the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris. Is Muslim violence the new normal in Europe? It's January 7th, and you're watching The Ezra Levant Show. Why should others go to jail when you're the biggest carbon consumer I know?
There's 8,500 customers here, and you won't give them an answer.
You come here once a year with a sign, and you feel morally superior.
The only thing I have to say to the government for why I publish it is because it's my bloody right to do so.
Today is the one-year anniversary of a series of Muslim terrorist attacks in Paris, France. Last January, Muslim murderers killed a cop on the street. They killed 4 Jews at a kosher supermarket. They killed 2 more in a hostage situation. But the center of the mass murder was at the offices of a satirical magazine called Charlie Hebdo, where they killed 12 people. Charlie Hebdo was an obscure magazine, really a gossip and criticism magazine, a radical dissident magazine in a way, a magazine grouchy about everybody, politicians for sure, any celebrities, especially about religion. They mocked every religion, including Islam, and that was their mistake. Mock Christians, they don't much care. Mock Jews, they might complain, but mock Muslims, and you get murdered. It was their express purpose. While the terrorists murdered their way through the offices, they talked to people in there. They spared some women, but not the Jews, of course. They said why they were there. This was the Muslim jihad, the holy war against infidels who had embarrassed Muhammad. Charlie Hebdo was an obscure magazine. It didn't have strategic importance to France, like blowing up a military base or even a police station would. It wasn't a skyscraper of commerce or even a dam or a factory. But understand what Islamic terrorists want. They want Islam, which literally means submission. They want the West to submit to Allah and his prophet Muhammad. So killing a dozen people who mock Muhammad sends a strong message to everyone else. If you even draw a picture of Muhammad, you're dead, let alone if you actually criticize Islam as a philosophy. And they knew it would work because they watched the Western world cower 10 years ago when a Danish newspaper published a dozen cartoons of Muhammad. No one was murdered at that newspaper. None of the cartoonists were murdered, though hundreds died in jihad riots about these cartoons around the world, especially in Nigeria. But the terrorists watched and learned how the mere anger of Islamic extremists was enough to terrify the West and cause a de facto publication ban on those Danish cartoons amongst 95% of European newspapers and 99% of them in North America. The Muslim terrorists watched how the mighty West crumbled upon itself just with a huff and a puff. The West was happy to blow its own house down. So imagine if terrorists actually shot someone, or a dozen someones. Charlie Hebdo was a symbol of freedom and secularism, a symbol of what you can say. The attack was so shocking that more than 1 million Frenchmen marched in solidarity with the victims. Many world leaders came to march too. They carried signs saying, "Je suis Charlie," which means I am Charlie. Some carried large pencils, but hang on, that's not what Charlie was. Charlie wasn't about saying we're for free speech. Charlie was actually about doing free speech, and in particular, speaking irreverently and critically about Islam. If you really were Charlie, 1 million Frenchmen would have held up pictures of Muhammad, showing they really were just like Charlie. Just like that scene in the movie Spartacus, you know, where slave after slave stands up and says, "I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. You've got to kill all of us." No, the French were just pretending to be Charlie, pretending to be brave by carrying Islam-approved props at the rally, pencils. It was a halal protest. If the French media and French politicians really were Charlie Hebdo, they would have all published the cartoon on their front page. The French president himself would have drawn Muhammad and held it up and said, "You'll have to kill every one of us because we all believe in freedom," which they don't, because they don't really believe in freedom that much, at least. Certainly not enough to put their lives at risk, and much, much more importantly, not enough to risk being called racist or against multiculturalism or, God forbid, Islamophobic. Islamophobia means fear of Islam. A phobia implies an irrational fear, but actually you'd be irrational not to be afraid of Islam these days, especially if you're a journalist or a politician or a political activist who is thinking of speaking out against it as comfortably as you would against any other religion or philosophy. Islamophobia, fear of Islam, is large. That's what terrorists do. That's the whole point of terrorism. In a real war, soldier versus soldier, Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, they would stand no chance against France's army, but terrorism is an asymmetrical war. It attacks social and cultural weak spots asymmetrically to get the West to surrender out of fear. But just as powerful as Islamophobia is Islamophobia. That is the fear of being called Islamophobic. I bet the terrorists didn't count on that one. They want Westerners to be afraid of Islam. Okay, mission accomplished. But what's even scarier to most Western liberals is being called racist or anti-Muslim, being called that by your own countrymen, by the media, by leftist activists. That's why the police in Rotherham, UK, stayed silent in the face of Muslim rape gangs, raping 1,400 girls year after year in a city of 250,000 people. There's almost no way terrorists could have killed or raped 1,400 girls in a city like that, other than in a 9/11 style mega attack. But it was Islamophobia that did it. Fear of being called anti-Muslim that stopped the cops from doing anything. Same thing going on right now in Cologne, Germany. The police are lying. The media are lying. The politicians are lying, covering up the 1,000 Muslim migrants who groped and robbed and assaulted and raped 100 women on New Year's Eve, the downtown plaza of Cologne, Germany's fourth largest city, and also in Stuttgart, Hamburg, and elsewhere. German police would eventually beat back 1,000 Muslim men, even if they were overwhelmed and surprised at first, but not even the mightiest German authority, the military, the police, anyone, everyone, could fight back against their real terror, being called racist. So that's the first problem. Not enough Westerners have been killed to be of sufficient worry and risk and danger that we're more afraid of Muslims than we are afraid of being called Islamophobic. You see what I'm saying? Here's a quick anecdote. 10 years ago, I was the publisher of a magazine called The Western Standard in Calgary, and we showed several of the Danish Mohammed cartoons to illustrate a news story on the subject. I received a few death threats, but the real attack on me came from the government of Alberta, the secular Western government of the province of Alberta. They had a 3-year investigation and prosecution of me for hate speech. It was really a blasphemy prosecution. I had contravened none of Queen Elizabeth's laws, but I had contravened Mohammed's laws. So in the name of Islamophobia, I had to be punished. I was a greater enemy to the state than radical Islam was. It goes without saying that in all the decades of Canada's human rights commissions, no Muslim has ever been prosecuted for hate speech, but plenty of people have been prosecuted for criticizing Islam. Back to Paris. A graphic warning here. I'm going to show you a terrible image. A year ago, it was 12 people killed at Charlie Hebdo, but in November, it was more than 10 times that number, 130 dead, mainly at this nightclub called Bataclan. Nearly 400 more injured in a massive series of terrorist attacks, again by Muslim extremists. So 10 times more carnage and nothing. There was no million-person march this time because Paris, like the police in Rotherham, have decided that 12 dead, 100 dead, that's bearable now. That's the new normal. They're desensitized. Now they'll abide it. When I went to Paris right after those attacks in November to see the reaction of the city, muted, doesn't even describe it. At the Place de la République that you can see on the screen here, where hundreds of Parisians spontaneously gathered, they were singing pop songs, including, I'm not even kidding, they were singing Oh Happy Day. They were singing that song. There was no rage or defiance, just some emotional queasiness as they realized that this is now how it's going to be a lot more. Because what can you do? There were 3 Muslim murderers a year ago, 2 brothers, Sharif and Saeed Kouachi, who attacked Charlie Hebdo, and then Amadi Koulibaly, who murdered 5 people, including 4 at the Jewish supermarket. All 3 of these Muslim terrorists, though, were born in France. They were born in France. Here's my point. Here's why mass Muslim migration into the West is so politically powerful. Because it's one thing to fight back against radical Islam if, like in the United States, only 1% of your population is Muslim. And if, other than a few neighborhoods in Michigan and Minnesota, there are no real Muslim enclaves, you can still fight back. You can still catch Muslim terrorists at the borders, probably. You can still send an army to foreign soil. But What if 5–10% of your country is Muslim, including many cities where it's 40, 50, 60% Muslim, where there are police no-go zones? How do you fight back when there are 1 million potential sleeper cells in your country, or even just 100,000, or even just 1,000? By the way, we're at 3% in Canada now, more than 1 million Muslims here, half of whom were brought in the past 10 years by Stephen Harper's Conservatives. Oh, and 50,000 more on the way this year from Syria alone. No vetting for Islamist ideology. But how do you deport someone born in your own country? How do you deploy your military in a counterstrike if the strike against you came from your own suburbs? How do you fight back when it's not quite terrorism, but it's more creeping Sharia law, like the street rampage in Cologne, Germany on New Year's Eve? 1,000 marauding Muslim migrants groping and assaulting and robbing and raping 100 women in the city's central plaza. That's not as deadly as the Paris attacks, but it's just as terrifying for the victims of it. But again, far more terrifying to the mayor and police chief and justice minister and chancellor is the terror of being called racist, of being called Islamophobic. So they intend to bring in another 1 million Muslim men this year between the ages of 18 and 35, like they did last year. And the mayor of Cologne is now telling women to follow a code of conduct. Oh, maybe put on a hijab, girls. Charlie Hebdo shocked France, but that shock wore off. The pain of the November attacks was 10 times worse, and France actually cares less. But we're the same here in Canada. We all said we were shocked when Muslim terrorists attacked us, when one gunman ran into our parliament. But we've forgotten that already. And we're bringing in 50,000 more unvetted Muslim Syrians. And the United States, that lost 3,000 innocents on 9/11, still has an open border, still has a president who can't even say the word jihad. It reminds me of this elephant here. I know this is, well, odd, but this is what I think of. The West is strong. Militarily, economically, our culture, our history is far superior to the medieval desert culture that treats women as slaves, hangs gays, subordinates all other religions, and is closed to freedom and inquiry and skepticism. The West is superior to Islam, or it was, because now we live in the post-Western society where we don't even believe in ourselves. We could defeat Muslim terrorists in a moment, but we don't. In fact, we invite more Sharia radicals to the West, and as it gets worse and worse, we just get more and more limp, like that elephant. And in the end, we don't even fight back. It's too tiring. It's too draining. They're not even fighting back in France now. Germany is in its final death throes, seems to me. What? Are they going to deport the 1 million men who just arrived? Yeah, you and what army? Great empires come and go. Nothing lasts forever. It took 1,000 years to build up our culture of freedom and prosperity and security. We got rich and fat and lazy and dainty. We enjoy our freedom, but not enough to actually fight for it, I guess. And hey, I mean, those Dolce & Gabbana hijabs, they look pretty fashionable, don't they? Yeah, maybe we don't need to teach about the Holocaust in schools anymore. Yeah, maybe we should ban pork from school cafeterias. Maybe we should just submit. Well, not me, not the United States yet, but France, yes. Germany, yes. And Canada? Well, where do you think we are? Stay with us. After these words, Dr. Daniel Pipes of the Middle East Forum. Well, today is the one-year anniversary of the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo and a Jewish supermarket and other victims in Paris, France, that left 20 dead. It's the one-year anniversary, and to mark it, I suppose, a Muslim extremist ran into a police station shouting Allah Akbar with what appeared to be a bomb strapped to his body. So it never ends. What has changed in Paris, France, over the last year? Joining us now via Skype to talk about this is our friend, Dr. Daniel Pipes of the Middle East Forum. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Pipes.
Thank you, Ezra.
I have a question for you. A year ago, when Charlie Hebdo was attacked, more than 1 million Frenchmen marched through the city. It was quite a stirring moment. But in November, not 1 year later, when 10 times as many people were murdered across Paris at various sites, so 130 murdered, 368 injured, and the response seemed tepid. It was 10 times the carnage. But there was no million-person march. There was no 20, 30 world leaders jetting to France to show solidarity. I went to Paris, and people knew something was not right, but they couldn't articulate it. It seemed like they had gotten used to a certain level of casualties. What do you think has happened in Paris over the last year?
Well, I certainly agree with you that you can't bring together 1 million people and all those leaders every time there's one of these atrocities. They happen too often. I'd also note that the atrocity a year ago, the attack, the assault a year ago, was partly against celebrities. The editors, the cartoonists, the writers of Charlie Hebdo were well-known figures, and I think that had a lot to do with it. Whenever you have someone who's well-known be assassinated, it has a much bigger impact than if they're not known. For example, in the Netherlands, Theo van Gogh was murdered in November 2004, and it had a huge impact on the country, and it was just one person. So I would attribute some to repetition and some to the fact that the Charlie Hebdo staff were celebrities.
I have a theory that terrorism is it scares people to a certain degree. That's the word terrorism. And Islamophobia, I mean, it's used as an insult, but if you look at it, I suppose it can mean fear of Islam. I mean, I am afraid of a terrorist bomb or a terrorist attack somewhat, but I think in the West there's a larger fear. I call it Islamophobia phobia. That is, being afraid of being called anti-Muslim.
Yes.
And I look at, for example, the New Year's attacks in Cologne, Germany, where up to 1,000 Muslim migrants swarmed German women and girls and groped them and assaulted them and even allegedly raped one of them. And I mean, that's terrifying, but I think the police and the mayor and the justice minister were actually more scared of calling it Islamic crime, just like the police in Rotherham, UK were more scared. Are we actually more scared of fighting against terrorism than we are of terrorism itself?
I think there's a deep reluctance to point the finger to Islam in any fashion, in part because there's a sense of guilt, and in part because there's a worry about the implications of this. Once you start looking at Muslims as opposed to non-Muslims, then that has all sorts of implications for the social order. To put it in brief, you'll have to have security like the Israeli airport or on the Israeli buses and restaurants. It leads to all sorts of difficult repercussions once you allow that there's a certain group of people, that there's a certain ideology in common. And so there's a great reluctance to do so.
Now, I read an interesting comment by you on your website that you don't use the word terrorism as much as some conservatives do. Not for the reasons that like the CBC or the BBC refuse to say terrorism. They don't say it because they think it's too judgmental and they don't want to take sides versus the terrorists versus stuff. You have a theory that there are better, more accurate and more powerful words to use than terrorism, the war against terrorism. Tell me your theory.
Well, in part it is that the word terrorism is never, nobody agreed, no two people agree on what it means. And so you have these endless sterile debates about whether something is terrorism or not. You'll have one police department say that this certain event was terroristic and the next one say it wasn't. You'll have the Iranian, the Saudi, and other malign governments using this word, the Syrian government, using this word to justify their attacks on civilians. It goes on and on and on. So it's a useless word in itself. Plus, even if you do agree with it, so what? What does it mean? What I'm really interested in, I think you're really interested in, is the motives for it. Not the technical nature of it, but what are the motives? Is this some family member who's upset? Is it a bunch of criminals who are fighting each other? Is it two rival lovers for a woman's hand? Is it just a crazy person? Or is it something that is ideological, has to do with who controls the country, who controls the world? That's what interests me. Is it jihad or is it not jihad, in short?
I think that's a great point, and it's something that our mutual friend Tarek Fata says. He really zeroes down. He says, are you for the jihad? Are you for violence to promote Islam or not. And that's really what's, I mean, terrorism, it's almost like saying, it's almost like a conservative objection to gun control. Well, a gun is a tool that can be used for good or for ill or by this person or that person. It's not the gun that interests conservatives or people care national security, it's people who use that tool. So terrorism, I suppose, means crimes to a certain kind of crime. But if you say radical Islam or the jihad, you're getting right through to it. And that's I think, so in that way I would agree that saying jihad or armed jihad or violent jihad is more useful than the phrase terrorism. Is that sort of where you're coming from?
Yeah, I've just stopped using the word terrorism in the last several months, and I find I don't miss it. Counterterrorism, I'm afraid, I still have to use, but terrorism itself, I don't use. Now, there are legal implications. If a crime is considered a terrorist crime, it has all sorts of implications, certainly in the United States, in terms of insurance, in terms of what kind of jail sentence, where the jail is, and all these other things. And I respect that, but at the same time, I think it is not a useful term. And instead of arguing over what is and what is not terrorism, a topic which takes up an awful lot of time, we should instead focus on, is this political, religious in nature? Is there a goal here about affecting the nature of the power structure, or is this just somebody doing violence for criminal or other reasons?
Yeah. Before we go, I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier, and that is what happened on New Year's Eve in Cologne and other German cities. I mean, it seems self-evident to me that when you bring in 1 million migrants, of whom, depending on what source you look at, up to 75, 80% are young Muslim men. So these are single, military-age men. To use a phrase, they're horny. They come from a culture that has not yet discovered chivalry or feminism or even treating women equally. So you bring in hundreds of thousands of young men, maybe who are not only not used to dealing with women, but maybe not even used to dealing with alcohol. You pour them into city streets in Stuttgart, Hamburg, Cologne. They see pretty Western-dressed women. It's a recipe for sexual violence, especially if you have that added layer of, well, she's just an infidel girl. She's, she's a kafir to begin with. Can you tell me what lessons emerge from what happened in Germany? I mean, it's incredible to me that Angela Merkel is doubling down and insisting that the refugees will continue to come by the million. What's going on there, and will anything stop it?
To me, the most remarkable thing about the Cologne incident is that there appear to have been something like 1,000 young men. Now, I initially thought there were 20 or 30. Okay, you're some rowdy group, but 1,000? That changes it entirely. So this is not your run-of-the-mill assault. This is something that must have been organized. This is something where there must have been communications. And surely someone could come forward and reveal. So it would be very, very interesting to find out how 1,000 men of Middle Eastern background found themselves in some fashion organized in front of the Cologne railroad station. As for Angela Merkel, what we're seeing is that the establishment, the politicians, the press, the police, the professors, the prosecutors, I like all the P's, are generally, even when they're conservative, like Merkel is, reluctant to acknowledge that there is an Islamic element, that there is a problem here. And when a problem does arise, as you noted, they double down. They just insist that you're not seeing what you see. And in Germany, at this point, in the last few days, there has been a severe restriction on the freedom of speech. In German, if you're going to be posting on Facebook or Twitter in German, you'll be cut off if you have things to say about these problems in Germany. You can do it in English, but you can't do it in German.
Freedom of speech. I didn't know that. I want to, you mentioned that this must have been organized, and I know the Justice Minister of Germany called it organized crime, and I scoffed. I thought, well, what, the mafia? There's a new way to make money here. They've got the gambling, they've got the illegal drugs. They're going to make money through sexual assaults. But I take your point that to organize 1,000 men, but let me push back on you on that one. If you bring in 1.1 million Muslims, which I understand is the number that Germany did last year, and if, let's say, 700,000 of them are young men. Okay, so in a city like Cologne, which I think is the 4th largest city in Germany, let's say you've got 100,000, or let's just say 50,000 young men, unemployed or unemployable, milling around, and it's New Year's Eve, and it's the Central Plaza, and it's excitement, and there's fireworks, and I don't think it's hard to imagine that in a city like Cologne, if you have 50 or 100,000 young Muslim men, that 1,000 are going to show up in the Grand Central Plaza on New Year's Eve. I mean, it would be like their Times Square. I don't think it takes someone organizing a bunch of young Muslim men if you've just poured in, 750,000 of them in the last year.
Grant you the demographics that you just gave, but I think having the audacity to go out and grope and rape the women there en masse requires some kind of organization. Somebody's saying, let's do this. We can get away with it. This is a good idea.
I think it's the mob mentality. Like I'm reminded.
I mean, we're speculating, but it just doesn't seem.
In Canada, we had Stanley Cup riots in Vancouver some years back, where there were so many people downtown. There was booze involved. There was a moment, and that mob mentality takes over. People say, "Oh, everyone else is doing it. I'm anonymous. It's dark. They don't know me anyhow. Everyone around me is doing it. I'll pile on." Anyhow, you and I are both speculating. It'll be interesting to see. You're right. If there was some form of communication, we might get light of it. But I think that what the most interesting thing I've learned from you today is that in Germany, any discussion of this has been clamped down on by Facebook, which is exactly what Mark Zuckerberg promised just before the New Year's. He said that any intolerance towards Islam will be shut down on Facebook. At
the behest of the German authorities.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? At the behest of the German authority. That is even more interesting. Well, listen, Dr. Pipes, we've taken up so much of your time. It's great to talk with you as always, even though the news is almost always bad. Thank you for joining us today with your expertise.
Ontario residents are being hosed on electricity prices. The latest Auditor General's report says we've been overcharged by $37 billion over the last several years. That works out to nearly $2,800 for every man, woman, and child. Why? Mismanagement and bad policy choices from the Ontario Liberals. It's going to cost us billions more in coming years. Energy Minister Bob Chiarelli won't take responsibility. He's lashing out. It's time for Bob to go. If you agree, go to firebob.ca. That's firebob.ca and make your voice heard.
Welcome back. My favorite part of the show. Deborah writes about Obama's cry about gun control. Obama may be able to start a new career in acting if Americans are ever able to remove his sorry butt from power. God knows that he has enough actors in his pocket that I'm sure they will be able to give him some grade B roles after that faux watershed moment. Well, you're right. I think Ben Shapiro was spot on yesterday when he said that, of course, Obama cares about kids being shot, but so do you and I. Obama's tears were just his tool to say, no, I care more than you, therefore my argument wins. I thought Ben's most subtle observation was that the very parents of shot children who were standing right around Obama, they weren't crying. They actually lost children, but he was just a huckster. He'd be a perfect Hollywood actor, though, narcissistic, leftist, politically correct. Stephen writes about yesterday's taxi versus Uber debate. Ezra, I was interested in hearing what Alex Pearson had to say about the taxi industry's concerns regarding Uber. But unfortunately, for the most part, you kept interrupting her and she could not finish a thought. Sometimes it's nice to hear what the other person has to say and then debate them on it. Oh. All right, fine, I take your point. It was more of a debate than an interview. I think I was more interrupting to get her to clarify than to rebut, I think. I don't know. I agree with her that the real solution is to lift regulations off of cab companies, not to put more regulations on Uber. And I think Uber should be more transparent about their insurance, sure. But I simply don't find it credible that a multi-billion-dollar company like Uber doesn't have insurance, doesn't have a dozen underwriters fighting over each other for the lucrative contract for their tens of thousands of vehicle drivers. I think what we see here, though, is a privileged group of taxi license owners whose medallions, that's what they call licenses, used to be worth $250,000, $350,000. Suddenly those medallions are worthless as mere citizens can now get into the driving business, and every normal person now realizes at once how awful this government-controlled crony capitalism has been for what, the past 100 years? Neil emailed me to say, are you guys pro-conservative? Hardly a rebel stance, more like an angry, well-informed sheep. Huh. But are you kidding? Because in Canada now, we've got a left-wing federal government and a left-wing Ontario government and a left-wing Alberta government and a left-wing mainstream media and left-wing universities and left-wing courts and 113 left-wing third-party campaign groups in the last federal election. Do you really think that leftists are the rebels, the dissidents, the courageous ones these days? It's not just that we are one of the only conservative voices in the country, it's that we're one of the only contrarian or independent voices in the country. I mean, even if you're a liberal, surely just for sheer variety, just to hear something other than ditto, ditto, me too, surely even a liberal would want to have a variety of ideas once in a while if you're feeling risque. Yeah, we are the rebels. And the fact that you're watching us and taking the time to write to me tells me you actually agree. Folks, thanks for joining us today. I'm looking forward to tomorrow's show already. Until then, keep fighting for freedom.